the fifth for people like us. And now you're going to be a legitimate citizen like these fucking racketeer senators on those fucking committees. You want to be like them? Come on, you ain't like them. They're strange people. They're from another planet, and they own this fucking country. They're bigger gangsters than we ever could be, and you know that. And you got this throat infection. What's with the throat infection? Huh? What's all that about? Huh? You're trying to talk your way out of something you can never talk your way out of. All of a sudden, you want to be half in, half out, half a racketeer. You can't have it both ways. You're either in or you're out. And whether you're half in or half out, that don't mean you ain't going to get caught the same way I could get caught or I could go down. It's the same thing. Come on, don't be naive. We don't control this, somebody else does. And then where the fuck are we? Way down the ladder. And I'm telling you, I can't.
Vito Genovese wasn't just another mobster. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and make the toughest men shut their mouths. A brute in a tailored suit. Ruthless, calculating, patient. If Lucky Luciano was the architect of modern organized crime, Genovese was the enforcer who could turn blueprints into reality, usually with blood. When Vito first joined Luciano's crew in the early 20s, it was a small-time operation with 20 guys hustling on the side. Genovese blew it up to 80 strong, ready for prohibition. He didn't stop there. He welded fractured street crews into a single outfit, transforming Luciano's family into the kind of empire that outlived both of them. Everyone knew where Genovese stood. Right next to Luciano from the beginning. Even if Luciano couldn't stand him personally, he couldn't ignore him. Vito had what Luciano called the memory of an elephant and the patience of a lizard. He knew exactly when to hit and when to wait. But Genovese came with baggage. He hated Jewish gangsters, said it out loud. That didn't sit well with Frank Costello, who was married to a Jewish woman, or with Luciano, who had learned the game from Arnold Rothstein himself. When Costello tried to bring Dutch Schultz and other Jewish outfits into the family's orbit, Vito pushed back. Costello won that fight, but it planted a seed of bad blood. A seed that blossomed in 1957 when Costello caught a bullet to the head. Vito's power stretched far and wide. He had allies like Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, guys who had once stood with Luciano and Costello, but now answered to Vito. His ambition seemed endless. Too endless. After the hit on Costello, Luciano and the old guard, Meyer Lansky, Carlo Gambino, Longy Zwilman, decided enough was enough. In 1959 they framed Vito on drug charges. The king of the underworld wound up in a prison cell, where he rotted until the day he died. Inside, Genovese faced a new kind of war. Robert F. Kennedy's Justice Department turned up the heat. FBI agents yanked guys like Joe Valachi out of their cells, interrogating them for hours, even when they had nothing to say. It was psychological warfare. It worked. Vito began to crack. He heard whispers that Luciano and his old friends had set him up. Paranoia poisoned everything. His alliance with Valachi turned into open hostility, the start of Genovese's final collapse. By the 1950s, the walls were closing in on all of them. Costello, Lansky, Carlos Marcello, Mo Dalitz, Tony Accardo, Paul Rica, Santo Trafficante, Tommy Lucchese. The Kefauver hearings put them under a microscope, dragging their names onto television screens across America. Then came the Apalachin meeting in 1957, when state troopers stumbled on a summit of bosses in upstate New York. A public relations disaster. Suddenly the Mafia wasn't shadowy anymore. It was national news. Deportation became the government's weapon of choice. The Justice Department listed more than 100 alien racketeers for removal. Italy said no, claiming these men had been raised and made in America, not back home. But Washington wasn't bluffing. Officials hinted that US economic and military aid might suddenly dry up if Italy didn't play ball. On the list, Costello, Lucchese, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Tony Accardo, Rocco Fischetti, Willie Moretti, and Vito Genovese. While all this swirled, Vito's personal life exploded. In 1953, his wife Anna dragged him into court for a divorce. What should have been a private matter turned into a tabloid circus. Anna didn't just ask for money. She testified under oath about his rackets, lotteries, narcotics, gambling, prostitution, even his ties in Europe. She painted a picture of a man living like a king at their $250,000 Atlantic Highlands mansion. Italian marble staircases, Chinese furnished bedrooms, servants, fur coats, 30 evening gowns bought under fake names. She told the court she'd been beaten, threatened, humiliated, that he once broke her nose, lit her hair on fire, and warned he'd put her in an asylum or drive her to suicide. She named names too. Said the house played host to Anastasia, Costello, Abner, Longhi, Zwilman, the Morettis. She said Vito handled meetings with the syndicate twice a week in New York, and that she personally managed tens of thousands of dollars a week from the Italian lottery. She revealed overseas bank vaults, Monte Carlo connections, narcotics pipelines, even investments in dog tracks and gambling boats. For a man who lived by secrecy, this was a nightmare. The public humiliation was bad enough. The exposure of his money, where it came from, where it went, was worse. The newspapers feasted on every word. And the feds listened. Witnesses lined up to deny Anna's claims, swearing they never saw beatings, never saw champagne parties, never saw Vito lay a hand on her. But the damage was done. His private life had been cracked open in front of the world. His enemies, on the street and in government, suddenly knew where to dig. By then, the mob world was already shifting. The Kennedys were in power. Robert Kennedy made it his mission to crush organized crime. Deportations, indictments, investigations. The pressure was unrelenting. And while some men like Lansky managed to stay afloat, even cozying up to politicians, Genovese found himself isolated. Hunted outside, betrayed inside, humiliated at home. For the man once feared as untouchable, the fall wasn't quick. It was slow, grinding, and public. Vito Genovese, who had built an empire on fear, ended up a prisoner, eaten alive by paranoia. His legacy splashed across tabloids, his power dismantled piece by piece. The week after Anna took the stand, March 19, 1953, the heat shifted. Not onto Vito, but onto her. The state liquor authority wanted her in a chair, under lights, to explain what she'd already said in Freehold. The papers framed it simple. The village joints were mobbed up, and the mob's front was paper thin. They started with the Savannah, 66 West 3rd. On the books it belonged to Joseph Schiavone and Sabatino Spina. On the street it was Tony Bender's joint, where Anthony Strollo and Joe Adonis played cards until Adonis went away. Then the 82 Club at 82 East 4th, corporate names Anthony Schiavone and Matthew Jacobson. And the Moroccan Village, 23 West 8th, owned on paper by Alan Bono and his wife. Anna said these places were the outfits run through fronts. If the investigators could nail down even a fraction of it, the SLA would pull the licenses. No booze, no business. She even dragged her own past into it. The Caravan Club, 578 West Broadway. Liquor license stripped years earlier for being generally disorderly. A label earned the night she cold-cocked a sailor with a bar stool. She wasn't moralizing. She was establishing a pattern, his and hers. She also repeated the number that stuck to Vito like gum. $20,000 to $30,000 a week from the Italian lottery. Enough to make $350 in alimony look like pocket change. The very next day they had her in front of a Hudson County waterfront grand jury. 2 hours. Deputy Attorney General James Rosen ran the room. He told the press she wasn't difficult, which meant she hit her marks. They'd match what she said to the Freehold transcript and work the overlaps. Ports, piers, money. She wasn't under subpoena to come back, Rosen said, but he figured she would. She'd also been tapped by the New Jersey Law Enforcement Council and would talk to them in Newark. Immigration men were there too, waiting for her in the hallway. Not for her, never for her. For him. Deportation was always the quiet threat humming in the background. The papers gave the color: coral jacket with a wide belt, white nylon blouse, multicolored tweed skirt, upswept hair, black suede heels, painted toes. Her lawyers closeted her, briefed her on spousal privilege. When she stepped out, immigration walked her to the elevator. Reporters tried her for quotes. Her attorney shut it down. The grand jury rolled on without her, calling cops about a Union Hall bombing, Local 1247 ILA, and a bartender named John Mueller who saw the blast. Different case, same gravity. In that building, everything pointed back to the same shadow. By then, Anna understood the angle. Danger came with Vito. Protection came with ink. Front pages made her radioactive. The spotlight didn't just shield her, it moved him. In Newark, an AP story made it official. The king of the rackets was ordered to pay $300 a week plus $5,700 in arrears or go to jail. If he stiffed her, they'd write the warrant. The order backed a December ruling from Judge Donald McLean. Vito had appealed and lost. He had 2 cases still open, his suit to divorce her and her suit for separate maintenance. But the money had to flow in the meantime. Vito's lawyer, Joseph F. Mattis, made the poor mouth. Said his client took home $125 a week from a company called Colonial Construction. Said he sent her $50 checks she didn't cash on advice of counsel. Offered her the house in Atlantic Highlands, sell it or rent it. The court didn't buy it. Records showed he hadn't even denied on the record that he had his hooks in rackets and nightclubs. And the calendar closed in on him. Law Enforcement Council tomorrow, Bergen County Grand Jury next week, immigration circling, Hudson and Freehold already in the book. The King of the Rackets tag from Governor Dewey hung on every paragraph like a wanted poster. Next day, McLean signed the arrest warrant. Mattis showed up at the courthouse, kept his mouth shut about next steps. The Monmouth County Sheriff's Office waited for the paperwork to land. Everybody remembered the testimony, 2 days of it, where Anna laid out the syndicate schedule like a bus timetable and parked Vito at the center. Then Vito caught a break. March 26th, a stay. The warrant would sit in the sheriff's mail until April 10th, when Vito was authorized to appear in Trenton and explain why he should be allowed to sell the Atlantic Highlands estate to pay what he owed. On paper, the place and its furnishings came to $250,000. Against it, a single $32,000 judgment. Mattis told the judge his client wanted to pay but had no cash, only the house. The judge gave him the runway. Vito's side also put on Dr. Attilio Favorini from Charlton Street to knock down earlier. Claims that he treated Anna for injuries she'd pinned on Vito. The doctor said no. Never treated her after she moved to New Jersey. It didn't erase the photographs the press painted with words, but it created fog. The same day, Anna did 2.5 hours before the Law Enforcement Council in Newark. They said she answered everything. Detectives babysat her cab to the city limits, whether they were protecting her from him or him from her. Testimony didn't matter. The effect was the same. Pressure. April made the humiliation public and cheap. Sheriff Ira Wolcott announced a Monday auction to satisfy that $32,000 construction judgment from contractor Dominic Caruso. Caruso had testified during the divorce case that the house had been quietly shopped for $55,000 with no takers. Anna said the place was worth $230,000. Either way, the number that mattered wasn't the value. It was the judgment. She was getting her $300 a week. He was getting stripped of the one thing he could pretend was legitimate, a deed. The auction notices ran again the next day. Same copy, same figures, because that's how you bury a man without putting him in the ground. You repeat his price tag until it sticks. On May 6th, the story turned from legal to voyeuristic. O'Reilly's Plaza. Art galleries, 9 to 11 East 59th Street, put the contents of the Seashore Palace on display. People lined up to stare. No antiques, the experts said. The Genoveses were modern. The showpiece was a giant glass and mirror bed with a peach satin spread and matching pillows, tabloid shorthand for excess, and now for loss. There were Chinese-painted TV and piano twins, a sterling punch set, Limoges china. Appraisers figured the lot might bring $10,000. Not enough to dent a syndicate, plenty to dent a reputation. The papers lingered on 2 6-foot marble lamps, one a woman in slacks, no brassiere, pajama top open, the other a woman in a harem skirt, no t-shirt. It played like theatre props from champagne nights Anna had described under oath. Big shots like Costello at the house, hollow-stemmed glasses clinking in rooms with Italian marble stairs. Now strangers pressed their noses to gallery glass to price the memories. This was the pattern: courts, councils, grand juries, and auctions. On March 19th, the SLA chased her story and put the village clubs under a microscope. Savannah, 82, Moroccan Village, fronts and all. On March 20th, the waterfront grand jury squeezed 2 hours of names, days, places, and money. Immigration hovered. Newark demanded its turn. The AP bulletin warned him, pay or sit. McLean's warrant said the same thing out loud. The stay bought him 16 days, nothing more. By April, his house was a notice on a sheriff's bulletin board. By May, his bed was staged like a crime scene in a midtown gallery. Vito had tried the old dodge, broke on paper, rich in reach. It worked on the street. It failed in court. The more he claimed poverty, the more his past spent for him. A $32,000 judgment, a $5,700 arrears tab, and $300 a week until the judges were done with both suits. Every move forced a countermove. Sell the house, sell the furniture, sell the image. Anna didn't have to be a crusader. She said it herself through her lawyers. She wanted her money. The government wanted his map. The press wanted the pictures. Together they tightened the ring. And for once, it wasn't a bullet or a boss that made Vito bend. It was a warrant, a sheriff's hammer, and a peach satin bed under warehouse lights. June didn't cool anything down. Vito went back to court on paper, swearing he was broken. In an affidavit to Judge Donald McLean in Trenton, he said he was absolutely unable to pay the $300 a week. No rackets, no outside property, nothing but a paycheck from a scrap paper outfit in New York. $107.20 take home, he said. 50 to Anna, 25 to lawyers, court costs, and he lived on $32.50. He'd even sold his '49 Buick to fund an appeal, and when he needed wheels, he borrowed his son-in-law's car. McLean heard it and took it under advisement. The record didn't forget. On January 30th, the court had set the alimony. In early March, it found him in contempt for ducking it. McLean stayed the jail warrant long enough for both sides to raise cash off the house and furniture. The Midtown auction had done $5,200. The Atlantic Highlands house was listed at $55,000. The best offer was around $45,000, with a $32,500 contractor's lien pinned to it. Anna had testified that the whole spread, house and furnishings, ran about $250,000. Vito's paper answer said there was no proof anywhere that he touched the Italian lottery, the piers, gambling, anything illegal. If any of it were true, he said, the undue publicity would have flushed it out already. He didn't appear. Joseph Mattis did the talking. Ozzy Silber for Anna said nothing in the affidavit was new. Meanwhile, justice was moving on him from another angle, deportation, arguing he'd varnished his record when he took his papers in 1936. The court fight settled eventually. The reputational damage did not. Dope dealer had started to stick, and that stain doesn't wash. From Italy, Charlie Luciano watched the headlines arrive. Red Levine, Meyer Lansky, Frank Scalise, Joe Adonis feeding him clippings and whispers. The empire still moved on his nod, but the lanes were jammed. Surveillance made simple messages hard. The same year, a book review cut through the noise. Ed Reed's Mafia. It sold the idea of a world syndicate. Palermo at the top, satellites on every continent, courts of their own, a treasury in the billions. Some of it read like a siren: Grand Council, passwords, saints burned in ceremony, communists in coalition. But the dope math had teeth. Joe Pesci, 1948. 30-odd pounds of heroin to Kansas City, cut into 1,000 million capsules at $1 or $2 apiece. Opium in one end, Italy and France. Refineries working, longshore help on both sides of the Atlantic. Cargo hidden in frozen birds, water tanks, behind boiler bricks. Agents said they were only catching 10%. On the docks, the Union doors turned easy when they had to. Reed traced the lineage back to Sicily. Patriots turned racketeers, then forward to prohibition, when the protection business grew into an industry. He didn't spare Vito, Mussolini confidant, AMG interpreter in 1945, black market on the side, shipped back on a murder, walked when the main witness died. The book swung wide, names, dates, bodies, and sometimes too wide, dragging politics without charges to match. But its picture of the pipeline matched what cops were saying privately. On the street, Vito leaned harder into what he knew. Prohibition had seasoned him. Enforcement kept him relevant. Costello tried to steady the board, show him how power lasts only when it sits at a table with allies. Vito didn't care. He carried a long resentment for the way Luciano and Costello rated him. Useful muscle, never a statesman. Costello still moved through restaurants and drawing rooms like a mayor without a city. The street noticed the tilt. Luciano kept a different posture, loyal to Igea, no mistress on the payroll. Costello spread money on his side life like confetti. Luciano said one mistress could have flown around the world twice on what Frank laid out. In any case, respect was measured another way. People feared Vito more. In 1957, he made the play. Frank Costello stepped into the lobby of his Central Park West building near 11 at night with a theatrical producer named William Kennedy. A heavy-set man around 6 feet slipped past the doorman, fired from 15 feet, and ran back to a black sedan. The .32 caliber round scraped across Costello's scalp, from left ear, under the skin, out by the right. Blood everywhere, no skull damage. Roosevelt Hospital in, X-rays, out to the station for questions. "Somebody tried to get me," Frank rasped. Later, "They must have mistaken me for somebody else." No one believed that. The shot redrew the map. Luciano, cursing from Italy, wanted a commission vote to take out Vito. He sent feelers through the Gambinos to reach Anastasia. Carlo Gambino killed the message before it landed, or Anastasia ignored it and chased his own war. Genovese sent his own men, Tommy Eboli, Mike Miranda, to talk peace. Luciano respected Miranda. With Eboli, it went hot. That was the moment Charlie knew his grip had slipped. On October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia went down, the boss who'd once been the blade of the syndicate. The next day, the papers didn't dwell on the barbershop. They wrote his resume, ending with the line, "Everybody knows he lived by the gun." he died by the gun. They traced him from Tropea, Calabria, one of 12 children, 4 boys to sea, dock brawlers who jumped ship into Brooklyn. Umberto became Albert, an enforcer on the waterfront. In 1921, he caught a death sentence for the killing of a longshoreman named George Turrell. The chair never came. Stays, a reversal, 4 state witnesses gone while he waited in the death house. The case died. 3 months later, another homicide arrest, dismissed. More arrests followed, nothing stuck. He did 2 years in 1923 for a gun. One of only 2 times he'd ever sit. The rap sheet kept growing. A 1928 shooting charge, dismissed. A 1932 ice pick murder of John Bazzano, dismissed. A 1933 homicide, acquitted. A 1936 vagrancy, discharged next day. Files went light, fingerprints and negatives missing after one arrest. By then he had real friends in important places. He built power where it mattered, the peers. Peer superintendent, 6 ILA locals under his thumb, and the right introductions: Costello, Adonis, Capone, the Morettis, Luciano. When Prohibition ended, the bosses formed a syndicate, divided the map, and created an enforcement arm for internal discipline. Anastasia ran it. Abe Kid Twist Reyes was his top hand until 1940, when Reyes flipped. From 1932 to 1940, murder incurs accounted for 63 known contract killings. Reyes said Anastasia personally ordered 32, including Union insurgent Pete Panto, shot and dumped in a lime pit in Lyndhurst, and Moish Diamond, an ILA agent who wandered off the line. Brooklyn D. A William O'Dwyer thought he finally had the case. Then, November 1941, Reyes fell 8 stories out a Coney Island hotel window while under police guard. The perfect case went out the window with him. A 1945 grand jury said there was still enough to indict and convict. No indictment came. In the war, Anastasia found camouflage in a uniform. Army, 8th Infantry Division, then Indiantown Gap, to teach longshore work. Honorable discharge in 44 as a tech sergeant. He used the service to lock down citizenship. A later move to strip it failed. He went legit. A dress company in Hazleton, a Spanish ranch-style house in Fort Lee, with a view of the river. Price tag, around $75,000. The family man pose didn't fool anyone. He stayed in the rackets, waterfront, trucking, labor, gambling, numbers, and traveled like a man who never had to show a passport. In 1955, a federal judge in Camden gave him a year and a $20,000 fine for tax evasion, then a civil push for the balance. It was an inconvenience, not a reset. By the fall of 1957, the board was set: Costello wounded but alive, Genovese ascendant, Gambino too quiet to read, Anastasia suddenly gone. Luciano studied the pattern and saw a familiar hand, calculated, patient, always moving 2 squares ahead. He suspected Gambino had been tilting the table all along. There wasn't much he could do about it. He had played the same game against Masseria and Maranzano and won. He knew the rule better than anyone. You live by the gun. You die by the gun. And in the middle of it, Vito Genovese, publicly poor on paper, privately feared in every room, kept pushing, even as the courts, the councils, and the newspapers made sure the world saw exactly what he was selling. They caught Anthony Tough Tony Anastasia outside a Midtown hotel on October 26, 1957. Face wet, jaw slack, the waterfront strong-arm man suddenly just a brother who'd lost his blood. Not long after, he met Frank Costello. 2 men, who once owned rooms just by walking into them, ended up holding each other and crying. Costello, the political kingmaker of the 20s and 30s, the man who could seat judges and make mayors, had become a survivor with a scar. He still had friends, plenty. But the next generation had studied the old guard and come up meaner. Costello could feel it. He was ready to step back. The cops said the list of people with a reason to kill Albert Anastasia was endless. The question was who got there first. For 36 of his 55 years, Albert either planned murders or authorized them. Word on the street said he was killed because he'd ordered the hit on Costello in May and botched it. Miss a shot like that and you sign your own contract. He knew it. He told a friend at Jamaica racetrack the week before he died that he didn't care what they did to him. He was worried about his wife and son. He tore up $100 tickets and looked 20 years older. Police locked down the crime scene and anyone touching it, barbers, elevator boy, passers-by. They guarded the family too, whether the family liked it or not. "We're going to talk to anybody we think will throw any light on this case," an official said. It wasn't bluster. They knew Anastasia's history and how often it slipped through their fingers. His record read like a scorecard with no final. 10 arrests between 1921 and 1954. 5 for murder. 4.5 years served. Mostly for a gun. In 1921, he and another man were condemned to the chair for killing a longshoreman named George Terrell. 18 months in the death house, then a technical reversal. By the time the retrial came due, 4 key witnesses were gone. Case dismissed, April 1922. In 1940, when Murder, Inc. blew open, Abe Kid Twist Reles put Anastasia in the chief executioner's chair. 3 of the mob's shooters rode the lightning. Then, November 41, Reles went out a window at the Half Moon Hotel while under police guard. Brooklyn D. A William O'Dwyer said his perfect case went with him. A Kings County grand jury in 45 said there was enough left to indict anyway. Nobody did. O'Dwyer ran for mayor and won on Murder, Inc. Albert spent the war hiding in uniform, tech sergeant, training soldiers to work docks. He used the service to cement citizenship, beat a later revocation bid, then wrapped himself in respectability. A dress factory in Hazleton, a $75,000 stucco house on Bluff Road, Fort Lee, fence, chauffeur, 2 watchdogs, Riverview. In 1951, the Senate Crime Committee called. In 1952, the New York State Crime Commission followed. He took the fifth on everything, how he lived, what he owned, who he was with. In 1953, the feds tried deporting him. By 1956, the case was dead. The Senate Rackets Committee planned to haul him in on labor racketeering. Then the barbershop happened. Midtown, West 55th and 7th. Gunmen came through a side barbershop entrance and left the same way. The AP wire photo showed the whole corner boxed in with squad cars. The better comparison came across the river in Hackensack. Willie Moretti's murder in Joe's elbow room back on October 4th, 1951. 4 shooters joking in Italian over coffee before they turned him into a headline. 6 years and 21 days later, 2 shooters did the same thing to Anastasia. Different tempo, same music. A Bergen County cop said the crew knew their job well, unlike the Costello debacle the previous spring. Then there was the missing shadow. Anthony Coppola, Albert's driver and bodyguard. He told police he learned about the killing at home in Fairview, said he picked up Albert's car at 11 a.m., 40 minutes after the hit, from a lot near the Park Sheraton, drove it to New Jersey, then had his sister bring it to a lot opposite 100 Center Street, the criminal courts building, where detectives found it that night. The story didn't hold. Chief of Detectives James Leggett said Coppola admitted walking up on the Park Sheraton minutes after the shooting, then disappearing. Leggett called him a liar on the record. By then, the department had questioned more than 60 people. Nobody gave them anything that mattered. Reporters did their family roundup. 9 brothers, 3 sisters from Tropea, Calabria. 2 girls and 1 boy dead young. 1 brother stayed in Italy as a rail worker. 1 went to Australia. Of the 5 in America, Tony, Tough Tony, the iron fist of the Brooklyn docks, nearly Albert's equal in a ledger of unproved mayhem. Joseph Anastasia, in and out of bookmaking and waterfront theft, dead at 51. Jerry, Gerardo, a light sheet. Frank, a quiet longshoreman. And Salvatore, the priest. The copy tied Albert to extortion, usury, wildcat strikes, assault, waterfront theft, trucking, laundry and garment shakedowns, gambling, and New York, New Jersey politics. He'd lived a charming life until the morning it snapped. His murder landed in the middle of a larger shift. The mob had always been opportunistic. War just widened the map. During World War II, Luciano's people built a relationship with US naval intelligence to keep the docks clean and smooth the invasion of Sicily. Afterward, there were contacts around the OSS, and later, the CIA, as Washington leaned on criminal networks overseas to block communist influence. The claim isn't that bosses sat in Langley offices, it's that interests aligned and doors opened, from Europe to Latin America and beyond, while American power expanded and old empires fell. In that fog, mob reach and government reach sometimes touched. Washington wasn't clean. Presidents Eisenhower and Nixon had orbiting figures with underworld ties. Harry Truman had proximity too. Southern mob outfits like Carlos Marcello's and Santo Traficantes worked the region. And northern brokers, Costello, Lansky, knew how to make introductions. That's how unions, ports, and politics got braided up. As for the FBI, by the 1940s, Hoover had made a habit of ignoring the word Mafia in public, even as informants told him what he didn't want to say. Allegations about his private life became their own currency. Meyer Lansky's ally, Louis Rosenstiel, and his wife Susan traveled in those circles. Years later, Susan described a Plaza Hotel scene she swore involved Roy Cohn and Hoover in costume. It's her account, vivid, disputed, and repeated often. Not a courtroom exhibit. In that world, rumor and leverage were the same tool. Three weeks after Anastasia went down, November 14th, 1957, the one thing even Hoover couldn't shrug off blew up in Apalachin, New York. A meeting at Joe Barbara's place turned into a harvest. Troopers stopped cars on country roads. Men scattered through the woods. Cuffed captains filled the local station. Headlines said 62. The early raw counts ran closer to 64. The exact number mattered less than the picture. Vito Genovese and his peers had called a convention in the open air, and the state caught them between coffee and dessert. Back in Manhattan, the image that stuck was Tough Tony outside that hotel, eyes red. Inside the newsrooms, editors picked the line that summed up the week. Albert Anastasia lived by the gun and died by it. Out on the street, the men who had studied him didn't waste time carving up the territory he left behind. Costello understood before anyone told him. This was a hand you folded, not one you fought. The next map was already being drawn. They called it a barbecue. 60-odd men, steak smoke on the hill at Joe Barbara's place outside Binghamton. State troopers called it what it was, a convention. November 15th, 1957. 3 weeks after Anastasia hit the tiles in a midtown barbershop. Cars with out-of-state plates stacked up at motels that didn't see tourists in November. Sergeant Edgar Croswell didn't need a snitch. He needed eyes. He watched the plates, watched the money men drift up the drive, then brought in 2 Treasury agents and a caravan of cops. They rolled up at 1 in the afternoon in plain sight. Pens out, license numbers first. The party came apart on contact. The cover story was insultingly simple. Visiting a sick friend. Barbara, 51, told a reporter he'd had heart attacks and it was good to see my friends. The hill said otherwise. Troopers boxed the roads, pushed into the yard, and counted bankrolls. Everyone carried fat. No one carried a gun. One man had $10,000 in cash. The rest had at least $450. They came from New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, California, Texas, Colorado, Florida, Pennsylvania, plus Cuba and Puerto Rico. Croswell called it a cross-section of national hoodlums. He'd seen smaller versions before. This was the big one. They grabbed 65, 13 in a field, the rest at the barricades. No charges. Everybody identified and turned loose. But the names mattered. Vito Genovese, 59, Dewey's king of the rackets, wham. That? His name had already been floated in the Anastasia killing. Around him, Joseph Profaci, the quiet produce baron with real weight. Vincent Rao of Yonkers. Natale Evola from Brooklyn. Paul Castellano, the butcher who wasn't just a butcher. Joseph Bonanno and his underboss John Bonventre. Russell Bufalino from Kingston. Drapery Man. Michelle Mike Miranda from Forest Hills. Frank Zito out of Springfield. Jimmy Ostico out of Pittston. John Scalish from Cleveland. James Coletti from Pueblo. Frank DeSimone, California lawyer with a second resume. Joseph Magliocco of East Islip. Joseph Ida from Highland Park. Joe Civello, Dallas. Simone Scozzari from San Gabriel. Papers said, alien. Home listed as Palermo. Frank and Costenze Valenti of Rochester. Louis, Cockeyed Louis, Larasso. Linden, Carlo Gambino, Labor Relations. Michael Genovese from Gibsonia. Gabriel Kelly, Manorino, Junkyard. Joseph Riccobono, Staten Island. Armand Rava, Brooklyn. Joseph Rosato, Union City. Joseph Falcone and Sal Falcone, Utica. Patsy Marjuri, Elizabeth. Carmine Lombardozzi, Brooklyn. Rosario Mancuso and Patsy Ciotino, Upstate. Sam and Patsy Monachino, Auburn. Sal Tornabe, New York City. Angelo Ciandra, orchestra leader. John DeMarco, Shaker Heights. Frank Cucchiara, Boston. And, from Havana, Louis Santo, Santo Traficante Jr., calling himself a hotel manager up for the day. The World Telegram and Sun printed what everyone in the room already knew. The agenda included slicing up Anastasia's stock, coin machines, vending, garbage hauling, the bread and butter rackets that pumped cash, while the Senate Rackets Committee stared at New York's trash. There was talk of policy in the Eastern Seaboard syndicate sense, not insurance. With Anastasia gone and Costello nicked, but breathing the map needed redrawing. The next day, state police doubled down with a list from the barracks, names of 9 others not recorded. They sketched the locals to show this wasn't all syndicate. Endwell dress factory owner, Anthony Guy, Garicri. Ignatius Canone, restaurant man. Bartolo Guccia, fish store. Emmanuel Ziccardi, shoe worker. Pasquale Turigiano, a grocery clerk who'd once run a still. And Joe Barbara Jr., 21, the son. They labelled the younger ones as the first to bolt. The old men, Gambino, Profaci, were too slow or too proud to run. In Buffalo, the paper itemized Western New Yorkers. Taxi boss John Montana, who went on the record saying he had car trouble, dropped in on an old beer business acquaintance, knew nobody, and would swear it under oath. Sam Lagatuta, house painter. Union officer James Laduca. Restaurateur Roy Carlisi. Mortician Antonio Magadino. And Dominic D'Agostino, an out-of-work narcotics pinch from long ago. Croswell called the crowd uncooperative and let them go. "We haven't a thing on them," he said, "but we made it clear we wanted them out of the area." And he did. YouTube historians like to sell a tip-off. There wasn't one. Not from Luciano in Sicily, not from Costello in a cell. In the 50s, television had already put these men in American living rooms. K-Forver's gavel made them celebrities and criminals at the same time. The Bureau's front office refused to say Mafia into a microphone, but the rot didn't reach every cop on every road. Sometimes one good cop acts. Croswell did. He put flashbulbs on a power structure that preferred shadows and proved in a single afternoon that an organization existed, coordinated and rich enough to touch unions, ports, city halls, and it didn't stop at the waterline. The fallout was immediate. Costello was already tangled in tacks and staring at bars. In Palermo, Luciano heard the news the way bosses always hear bad news. Fast, wrong first, worse on confirmation. He'd felt good enough to eat that day. A runner came to the table. He paid, walked out, got home, threw up, and hit the floor. The rule he'd drilled into everyone, that major meetings happen only on home turf, had been ignored. Atlantic City under Nucky Johnson, Chicago under Capone, and Accardo, Havana when Havana was theirs. Never right after a major hit. Never where you couldn't control the ground. Genovese ignored that, made a show of strength 3 weeks after Anastasia, and picked a hill in upstate New York because it felt quiet. Buffalino arranged. Barbara hosted. The quiet wasn't theirs. The arrests put Senate and committee chairs on camera again. 2 names benefited most: Jack Kennedy and his brother Robert. Jack parlayed hearings and headlines into the White House within 3 years. Robert took justice and turned organized crime into a department priority. In back rooms, the reaction was simpler. Luciano wanted Genovese dead. He'd done it before, Masseria, Maranzano, when it served the future. This time he did the math and saw the price. Either his life or his family's. From Sicily, isolated and increasingly unsure who in New York still belonged to him, he held his fire. The old guard had thinned. The ones who rose with him were dead or displaced. The new guard, Gambino, Accardo, Giancana, Trafficante, and Vito, didn't fear deportees. That was the lesson. Once you were gone, your power rotted. Joe Adonis learned it. Others pretended not to. Even so, in Sicily, Luciano's name still meant order. Palermo respected him. So did the men who mattered there. Carlo Gambino, who intended to take New York the way men take cities, with patience, knew his roots ran back to Palermo and kept his lines to Luciano clean. Messages ran both ways. One came through clear: frame Vito. Costello wanted Vincent Chin Gigante punished for missing his shot. Gambino had his own housekeeping. Carmine Galante needed a cell to cut Joe Bonanno's legs. 2 tracks formed, one against Washington, which would become the mob's biggest political mistake, backing the Kennedys into power, and the other a straight drive to put Genovese behind a steel door. Luciano was explicit. Narcotics would be the charge. Build it, box it, close it. Joe Valachi's words would come later, but the plan started now. The first pass missed. Luciano raged. Gambino promised results. Vito first, then Galante, then the rest. He understood the new arithmetic. Control wasn't in speeches or salutes. It was in who set the table, who called the vote, and who chose the courthouse. Apalachin had blown the secrecy. The answer was to use the light like a weapon. Back on that hill, Croswell left the meeting with nothing on paper and everything that mattered in hand. A photo of America's underworld, assembled in one place, pretending to check on a sick friend. No one believed it. The stake smoke cleared, and the country saw the outline of a shadow government. The men who walked away that day understood what Luciano felt on the floor in Palermo. The old rulebook was dead, and the next move had to be made in full view. He'd always denied everything. Cool, flat, lawyer at his elbow. Then, in late 1958, Vito Genovese let 2 Australian reporters into his kitchen in Atlantic Highlands and showed them a different mask. Sunday, November 23rd, The Sydney Morning Herald ran it on page 18, a brief walkthrough of the Mr. Mafia home life. No marble staircase, no guards, no gun on the table. A small weatherboard cottage at $100 a month, 5 suits, the newest 2 years old, a dozen shirts, 3 pairs of shoes. He wore an apron and worked a pan of chicken cacciatore. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, explaining he did his own cooking because he was fussy about food. The reporters had expected a $40,000 mansion. They got a rented box and an act of austerity. He was going to trial in a fortnight as the alleged head of an international narcotics combine. On money stashed overseas, his estranged wife swore he hid $32 million. He waved it off. "Women, women, women," he said behind his glasses. "This woman lived with me for 20 years. Then she put the blast on me. She made up a lot of stories about me owning dog tracks, racetracks, power plants in Italy, nightclubs, the Italian lottery, and putting money in safe deposit boxes in Switzerland on Mussolini. I had no relationship with Mussolini. I never saw Mussolini, except in pictures." 2 weeks later, the tone changed. July 8, 1958. UPI moved a story under the headline, "Suspected Mafia Chief, Gang Boss Nabbed in US. Major Crackdown." Side-by-side photos of Genovese and Vincent Chin Gigante. Federal agents took Vito at his Atlantic Highlands house and grabbed Gigante 2 hours earlier in a Greenwich Village social club. A sealed indictment broke open a bigger picture. A ring responsible for smuggling hundreds of pounds of narcotics into the US annually. US Attorney Paul W. Williams called Vito's arrest one of the most important arrests ever made in this field, said Genovese was the hub and Gigante a rising star. Other arrests were imminent. Williams said it could drive the Mafia out of business. The Wire reminded everyone Vito had a police record dating to 1917, homicide and felonious assault arrests that never stuck, and that he'd been a delegate at Apalachin, reputed head of gambling, vice, and waterfront rackets on top of drugs. The same day, another paper ran the longer cut, a resume by Carl R. Baldwin, America's #1 criminal. If the narcotics indictment held, he wrote, Genovese could be on his way out. But bookmakers weren't shifting odds on a man who'd slipped so many hooks. Baldwin stacked the track sheet, sallow-faced, tight-lipped, charged once on an ironclad murder indictment. A man who aided Nazi and fascist high command, who hijacked American military supplies on US Army trucks in wartime Italy and sold them on the black market, escaping prosecution each time. For years he'd lived like a country gentleman in a 9-room home with marble stairs overlooking Sandy Hook Bay, directing shylocking on the waterfront and the heroin trade, with enough reach that informants rarely lived long. One exception was his wife, Anna. Vito tried to dump her. She detonated. In a New Jersey courtroom, the woman scorned delivered a ledger. She wanted $350 a week separate maintenance and told the judge Vito earned at least $40,000 a week from narcotics, gambling, waterfront labor rackets, a lottery in New York's Italian district, dog and horse operations, plus legitimate interests. He's involved in almost all the rackets, she said. She described drunken parties at their Atlantic Highlands mansion, Costello, Anastasia, trips to Europe with never less than $100,000 cash for the syndicate, and weekly bundles of $20,000 to $30,000 tucked into safe deposit boxes in Atlantic Highlands, Red Bank, New York, Naples, and Switzerland. The court refused Vito's divorce, ordered him to pay the $300 a week. He claimed she lied, and he only took home about $125 a week. He sold off furnishings to show good faith. In May 1953, O'Reilly's Plaza Art Galleries put up the slice of married life the tabloids loved, an outsized double bed with a huge mirrored headboard and peach satin spread and pillows, a TV and piano in matching Chinese motif, a Limoges dinner set, a sterling punch bowl, and 2 6-foot marble lamps shaped like half-dressed girls. The federal pressure wasn't built on Anna alone. Baldwin reached back to the Senate Crime Committee in 1950. Witnesses pretended they'd never heard of Vito. "I don't know the name," said Ralph Bottles Capone. Kefauver's staff kept pushing. They found men who did know Don Vitone. The dossier grew. Vito arrived from Sicily on May 23, 1913. First gun pinch in 1917 at 19. A dozen more arrests. Homicide, assault, robbery, concealed weapons, narcotics. In the 1930s, he carried for Lucky Luciano and rose above the street, introduced as the Great One. In 1934, a crooked card game scored $116,000 from a rich mark. Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia, one of the crew, demanded $35,000 and had already crossed Vito once. He and Willie Gallo had stuck up an alcohol plant of Tony Strollo's in 32. Vito convened his circle: Peter DeFeo, Gus Frasca, George Smurra, Michelle Mike Miranda, and wrote Boccia's death warrant. He added Gallo's name for good measure, then perversely hired Gallo and Ernest the Hawk Rupolo to do Boccia. Quietly, he told Rupolo to shoot Gallo afterward. They stalled. Boccia stayed vertical for weeks. Other shooters got the job. On September 9, 1934, Boccia finally died. Rupolo tried to keep his side promise and put a few rounds into Gallo. Badly. Gallo lived and talked. A decade later, Rupolo flipped to save his own skin after botching another murder, 5 shots into Carl Sparacino, who stayed alive. He tied Vito to Boccia's killing and named another witness, Peter Latempa. By then, Vito had skipped the country, ingratiating himself with another brand of gangster, Benito Mussolini. For a $250,000 gift to the fascists in the Nola district, Vito got the title Commendatore of the Italian Empire. He dined with Hermann Goering and Count Galeazzo Ciano, used his grip on the Italian Electrical Association to move black market deals, threatening to cut power if merchants didn't play. In April 1944, O.C. Dickey, U.S. Army CID, started tracking the theft of Allied supplies and found Vito everywhere. Badges, passes, stolen trucks loaded with flour and sugar, AWOL Canadians in American uniforms delivering to a vineyard near Nola with the password "Genovese sent me," equipment burned afterward to erase the trail. Dickey raided Vito's Naples apartment. Papers that tied him to the racket, a shortwave receiver of the type used with long-range transmitters. The transmitter never surfaced. The question, spy, hung unanswered. Money floated too. Gold seal, US currency. Off the gold standard, moving through hands that weren't supposed to have it. Dickey held Vito 6 months. He fought his own chain of command to get him back to New York for trial. No one met Dickey at the dock. Time did the rest. On June 11, 1946, before Judge Samuel Leibowitz, the Boccia case collapsed. Witnesses had died or vanished. The key man, Latempa, was poisoned in Brooklyn Civil Prison on January 15, 1945, 7 days after Dickey got orders to bring Vito back. Leibowitz stared at Genovese and said, if there'd been even a shred of corroborating evidence, he believed Vito would have been condemned to the chair. Vito sneered, walked, and stepped right back into the American underworld, above Costello and Anastasia, while Luciano, paroled by Dewey and shipped out to Italy on murky aid to the invasion of Sicily claims, rebuilt in Palermo. The liaison, especially in dope, closed the loop. Luciano abroad, Vito at home. By 1958, the loop tightened. The Justice Department had moved to strip Vito's citizenship. Deportation buzzed. The Senate Labor Rackets Committee called O.C. Dickey to relive the Naples file. 10 days later came the UPI indictment story. The photographs and the phrase "rising star" hung under Gigante's face. In Atlantic Highlands, the same man who sautéed chicken for foreign reporters talked about answering in detail after the trial and promised to call you fellows. Outside, the walls were closing. Inside, the record stood. A lifetime of denials, a wife who put the blast on him, a poisoned witness, a dismissed indictment, a mirrored bed sold at auction, and now a federal narcotics case with his name pegged as the Hub. The empire that had once stayed in the shadows was on paper, in court, and on the front page. The man who'd made a career of not leaving evidence had left plenty. 3 weeks after Anastasia hit the floor of that midtown barbershop, Vito Genovese was back in the papers. Troopers crashed Joe Barbara's backyard in Apalachin and found about 65 men visiting a sick friend. The convention broke up in a scramble across fields and roadblocks, but the roll call stuck. It looked like a meeting called to settle the books after Anastasia's murder. Next came Washington. Before Senator John McClellan's committee, Genovese turned stone, Fifth Amendment, again and again, roughly 150 times, then walked out into a new headline: a federal narcotics conspiracy indictment. The case sketched him as a $30 million boss driving a 37-man pipeline from Europe to the States. The bill also named Vincent Chin Gigante, fresh off an acquittal in the Costello shooting, Carmine Galante, and John Ormento, a top dope man. Luciano's name wasn't on it, but agents who'd lived this world bet he helped start the shipments. That same day, the whispering got louder. In the underworld, omerta makes good copy. The real rule is power. Men who quote the code use it when it helps and break it when it doesn't. Costello once threw a man out a window for talking. Luciano and Gambino weren't sentimental either. Now those same men were angling to put Vito in a box. The game was the game. The myth was for the tourists. By January 1959, the case had a courtroom. Drug trial. Selection of jurors continues today. Day 2 in federal court, New York. 17 co-defendants with Genovese, a multi-million-dollar ring. Worldwide links, the government said. The first trial date had slipped 4 times on illness. Now the panel crawled forward. 26 jurors examined out of 223. Genovese tried one last delay. His lawyer asked the Court of Appeals to adjourn so he could grill a customs agent, Benjamin Robert Beggendorf, who'd paid Vito an unauthorized visit in December. The defense wanted to know if Beggendorf had tried to entrap him, wire in his coat. The government said the agent hadn't reported the contact and wouldn't be called. The appellate court heard the argument and denied the stay. Outside the courthouse, pressure multiplied. The Luciano family now wore Vito's name on the door, but the weight of it sat on his neck. Senator John Kennedy and counsel Robert F. Kennedy bore down on him and Mike Miranda. Every decision looked worse in the rear view: the Anastasia hit, the collateral deaths, and now a narcotics case that wouldn't go away. Vito still saw himself as the man who'd survived worse. The map said otherwise. In Cuba, Castro was consolidating, and the Havana connection was wobbling. At home, politics and law were aligning. Whatever the CIA did or didn't do with certain bosses stayed buried at the time. What showed above ground was simpler. Washington was finally pointing the camera at the right faces. If the older guard underestimated the Kennedys, that mistake would cost them. 4 years later, both brothers would turn the country's TV sets into a witness stand and then pay for it. Parade's Jack Anderson laid out the mechanics. Anastasia murdered in a chair, gunman gone like smoke, 16 months of nothing. That was the pattern. Mob hits unsolved while ordinary murders cleared. Professional shooters flew in, pulled the trigger, flew out. Witnesses clammed up. Evidence evaporated. Arnold Baumann, who helped dissect Apalachin, gave 3 reasons: trained killers, interstate lines, terrified witnesses. He could point to a dozen Apalachin men linked to homicides who'd beaten the cases. Kiefover's agents, Frank Ahern and Tom Cahill, quietly collected the files. Jimmy Lumia blasted by imports in Tampa. John Golding shot through a closed window in Chicago. Bodies rumored in mine pits in southern Illinois. Assailants unknown coast to coast. Favorite tools the sawed-off shotgun and the .45. Once in a while, the mask slipped Houston copped a Mafia killing, yanked a parole. A hitman admitted membership. More often, fear dictated the record. A Chicago tavern full of customers watched 2 pros come in the side door and leave 2 bodies on the floor. Nobody saw a thing. Old scores were settled with signatures, men trussed with rope in car trunks. A pattern repeated years later in another city. In Kansas City, a boy was murdered to send a message. The detective who made the arrest died for doing his job. A minor player, Carl Caramusa, told what he knew, hid under a new name, and got his head blown off 3 years later while waiting for his family. The committee rooms put faces to the file. Mike Miranda sat under Robert Kennedy's questions and pled the 5th to everything: Boccia, la temper, value of human life. McClellan had to warn witnesses not to say anything that might get them killed. In that theatre, Genovese was a familiar act, a kingpin who claimed 6,000 in 1954 taxes, while agents said he sat on millions, the arbiters and enforcers around him trained to make cases disappear. Police tried to adapt. Big city squads started building real intelligence, phone calls between departments, an interstate network. New York State Police, embarrassed by Apalachin, came west to study the system and joined it. The wish list stayed blunt: more cooperation, better eyes and ears, federal laws with teeth against interstate murder. Hoover's line was icier: every unsolved crime is encouragement. By March 1959, another shoe dropped. John Ormento had stepped forward in the record as a ringleader on the narcotics pipeline and sat on $250,000 bail. Inside the courtroom, jury selection ground on. Outside, the people who'd once moved only in shadows were on paper, on wire photos, in hearing rooms, and headed toward a verdict. Genovese had spent a life denying, hiding, and surviving. Now the men who taught him the rules were using them against him, and the country he'd gamed had finally learned how to keep score. The first crack showed in March. Agents hit a Bronx walk-up and found exactly who they were hunting. Nick Tolentino was traced to the building. As the team closed in, a heavy man came down a stairwell and walked straight into handcuffs. It was Big John Ormento, 47, 240 pounds, smirk on his face like the cuffs were a joke. In court, acting U.S. Attorney Arthur Christie burned them down on the record. Judge Edmund Palmieri set bail like a message: $150,000 for Ormento, $100,000 for Tolentino. Separate narcotics conspiracy indictments, separate pleas due in the morning. They weren't strays. Ormento had been on the run since June, named with Vito Genovese and 35 others in a dope conspiracy. Vito, the man newspapers now called the American Mafia's top hand, was already sitting in a federal courtroom with 15 co-defendants when Ormento hit the docket. Tolentino had vanished in January '58 on another narcotics case. 9/11 in that one were already convicted. Christie told Palmieri Tolentino had staged a traffic jam so a co-defendant could slip a tail. On Ormento, he didn't hedge. One of the most consistent and chronic narcotics violators in this country, close associate of many narcotics violators, attended the 1957 Apalachin Convention. When the Watchdog Committee dragged him in on that meeting, Ormento had pled the fifth 250 times without blinking. His sheet read like a career path: 3 years in 1937 for narcotics, 8 years in 1941 for narcotics, 2 years in 1952 for narcotics, 4 years in 1954 for narcotics, 53 for narcotics, and a $50 bookmaker fine in 48 like a punchline. The government said he built supply lines from Europe and Mexico and worked the usual rackets, garment, trucking, waterfront, where force moved freight and the book stayed dark. This wasn't just about Aumento. It was the first stage where Vito's protection started to peel away in public. The pressure had been building all month. March 1st, a front-page piece, Stop Pretending, Brotherhood of Evil, the Mafia. Not a whisper, a diagnosis, Anslinger's warnings, Kefauver's hearings, and the Apalachin roundup welded into one story. Luciano building an international narcotics syndicate, murder, Inque, as policy, Anastasia's why and Costello's near miss, Scalise dead for breaking rules, Capone's template spread across the country. The foreword said, make it required reading. The point was obvious. The Mafia existed. It was national, and it lived off narcotics, gambling, and labor rackets. The public was finally hearing what cops had been shouting in empty rooms. March 5th, the government put something simpler in front of Vito's jury. Ex-agent Daniel Moynihan took the stand and told a clean buy, Midtown Hotel, prearranged meet with a co-conspirator named Charles Pappalardo, package tucked in a newspaper on a phone booth shelf, $275 across, lab test confirmed pure heroin, no romance, no code, just dope in a lobby and money on the glass. 2 days later, the defense tried to turn the bench into the fight. March 7th, Los Angeles defendant Luis Fiano sat under Assistant U.S. Attorney Jerome Londin and objected through his lawyer Martin Carmichael like it was a sport. Entrapment, arrest rights, every angle. The judge pushed it to Monday. It didn't move the needle. The government wasn't building one witness or one raid. They were running the table. Then came March 12th and the Washington scorecard. Jack Adams wrote it as a ledger. Attorney General William Rogers had ordered a long-term quiet push to line up the 100 top hoodlums and either lock them up or ship them out. Milton Wessel was called back to coordinate information from FBI, immigration, Treasury, counterfeits, narcotics, alcohol, taxes, and tie it to what state attorneys general were seeing. The Apalachin list, 60-odd names, was no longer a curiosity. In the year since the task force started, Genovese had been indicted on narcotics and was on trial. Russell Bufalino, another Apalachin man, had a deportation order. Joe Profaci, denaturalized. Frank Costello, already doing time on taxes, had his citizenship revoked. Paul, the waiter, Rica, took 3 years on tax. Peter Licavoli, 2.5. The point wasn't sensational. It was systemic. Pick them off where the evidence fit. In Vito's courtroom, the grind showed. By March 13th, the trial had run 11 straight weeks. Tempers snapped. Judge Alexander Bix told defense lawyer Maurice Edelbaum to sit down. Edelbaum objected to the judge's attitude on the record. It read petty. It wasn't. The case was heavy, and the clock was wearing everyone down. Upstate, the cleanup crew kept working. The same day, Syracuse headlines put Joe Barbara Sr., the silent host of the 1957 Hilltop Barbecue, on the hook for tax evasion. $14,600 unpaid, $38,000 unreported income, false corporate returns, potential $80,000 fines and prison if convicted. He'd fought every subpoena since Apalachin, always too ill, a heart case in a hill house he was trying to sell. Bail set at $10,000. His son, Joe Jr., 23, was under perjury indictment for saying his father couldn't leave the house while investigators said he had. And the men who'd run for the trees in '57 were finding out what refusal really cost. New York's Court of Appeals held 7 Apalachin delegates in contempt for stonewalling the State Investigation Commission. The names were a map: Paul Castellano, Manhattan; Carmine Lombardozzi, Brooklyn; Frank and Costenze Valenti, Rochester; Michele Mike Miranda, Queens; Rosario Mancuso, Utica; Joseph Riccobono, Staten Island. Chairman Jacob Grumet called the ruling a milestone, a message to recalcitrant witnesses that immunity meant talk, and refusal meant jail, for as long as it took. Their terms were open-ended. Others joined them. The Fifth Amendment was a shield in federal rooms. In Albany, after immunity, it was a ticket to a cell. Thread it together, and the picture is simple. March started with a Bronx arrest that put a chronic trafficker on an extremely high bail and tied him publicly to Vito and Apalachin. It moved to a clean buy in a midtown lobby. It showed a defense that could argue, but not slow the machine. It posted Washington's quiet plan to separate men from papers, passports, and money. It put a host on a tax indictment and locked 7 delegates in city cells until they talked. And it kept Vito in a chair, week after week, while the country that never used to say the word Mafia learned it, printed it, and began to make it mean consequences. Genovese had chased the top spot, painted his name over Luciano's, and called it a family. He got the weight that came with it: a narcotics case with witnesses, a network of agencies sharing files, judges snapping at defense counsel, and lieutenants like Ormento pulled down stairwells into cuffs. Election year or not, the old play, buy time, buy silence, buy distance, was failing. The first stage of his fall didn't look like a headline. It looked like a calendar. March 1959. Names, charges, rulings. The walls moved in. By spring 1959, Vito could read the ending. The trial was burning hot, the headlines hotter, so he did what bosses do: pulled his people in. Sit-downs, tight rooms, old faces, Mike Miranda among them. One meeting cracked wide open. Lawmen knocked on the door and walked out with Vito, Miranda, and 23 more. The message was simple: nowhere was safe. March 16th, the government put its cards down. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jerome London finished by reading from a June statement by defendant Alfredo Aviles. Heroin bought in May and June, resold, no flourishes. Acting U.S. Attorney Arthur Christie said 2 words to Judge Alexander Bix: "We rest." The street said one thing, the backdrop said another. While Vito fought for his life, Carlo Gambino, Frank Costello, and Charlie Luciano were playing a longer board. Miami had rooms where Russell Bufalino, Gambino, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and quiet men with government badges talked Cuba and covert plans. The same circle was easing Vito toward a cage. The code bent when survival required it. 2 days later, March 18th, the defense opened. Out of turn, Carmine Polizano went first. His lawyer, David Schwartz, put a liquor company timekeeper on the stand to swear Polizano was a truck helper, steady employment back to 47. Christie used the same witness to show the timekeeper had checked him in when he wasn't there. It was that kind of case. Every clean fact smudged on cross. March 20th, Vito moved for acquittal. Bix denied most motions, reserved on 4. Benjamin Rodriguez, Salvatore Santora, Nelson Cantalupes, already doing 20 in California on a 58, federal narcotics conviction, and Natale Evola. Maurice Edelbaum, for Evola, dragged in the Hotel del Rio's books. No transients in 56, no Latin names. A government witness had sworn to meetings there with a Mexican courier called Mexico. The ledgers said otherwise. Bix listened, held his fire. The grind got human on March 24th. One juror fell ill, proceedings stalled, then restarted with the defense swinging at the pillars. March 25th, the attack centered on the government's courier, Nelson Silva Cantalupes. Roy Reardon called him a thief, grifter, adulterer, liar, and narcotics peddler. Mark T. Smith said no jury should believe him. George Todaro called both Cantalupes and Joseph Basile bargain witnesses with everything to gain, nothing to lose. Robert P. Kaufman hammered them again for Charles Di Palermo. The trial had started January 5th. By then, the room had heard every shade of the same word: unreliable. March 26th, Santora asked for acquittal. Cantalupes had told 3 versions of his first meeting with Santora: Midtown hotel room, then a car outside, then an Italian restaurant. Bix took it under advisement and, that day, acquitted only Joseph Vento. 17 defendants became 16, and the summations rolled in alphabetical order. March 27th, Martin Carmichael called out the playbook straight. Witnesses coached. He told the jury Cantalupes had been questioned over 100 times before trial and rehearsed, the only man out of 30 government witnesses who tied Carmichael's client, Los Angeles defendant Louis Fiano, to 4 or 5 pounds of gift-wrapped heroin in 1955. Outside that courtroom, Washington was calibrating pressure. March 29th, another Ledger story. Attorney General William Rogers' non-sensational campaign. Milton Wessel coordinating FBI, Immigration, Treasury, and state AGs. Field posts in New York, Chicago, LA, Miami. The Apalachin attendees under a microscope. The scorecard read: Genovese indicted and on trial. Bufalino ordered deported. Profaci denaturalized. Costello stripped of citizenship in prison. Paul Ricker and Peter Licavoli on tax convictions. An Apalachin delegate in Scranton indicted over Knox coal, sweetheart money. Longy Zwilman hanged himself after a fresh FB. I move in his old tax case. The center was held in Washington. April 1st, the defense rested. In the same news cycle, agents finally took down 2 ghosts in a Bronx apartment, John Big John Ormento and Nicholas Tolentino, top dope men on old indictments, bail set like brick. $150,000 for Ormento, $100,000 for Tolentino. In Vito's case, Herbert Siegel closed for Santora and ripped Cantalupes again, pointing out how the witness had moved people from hotel room to car with a single correction. Not a scintilla, Siegel said, asking for acquittal. April 2nd, Vito swung at the headlines and missed. His lawyer, Menahem Stim, asked for a mistrial over stories calling Genovese Ormento's bosom pal and reputed head of the dreaded Mafia. Judge Bix wouldn't bite. If we can't rely upon a jury, we might as well discard our entire jury system. Christie opened his summation and denied any brainwashing of witnesses. April 3rd, it went to the jury. 7 women, 5 men, sequestered at midnight. 30,000 words from the bench, 8 hours of charge. Each defendant to be weighed alone. The government called Vito the control man of a transnational ring sourcing Europe, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico. The defense gave him back as a $225 a week executive. On paper, he was a man the police had known since 1917 and never put away. In the jury room, he had a question. Run the calendar back a few days, and you can see why he'd tried to gather his captains. The prosecution had rested clean. Motions were falling flat. Witnesses were bruised but standing. Washington was stacking wins. In Miami, men who once raised glasses with him were hedging their futures with other partners, other wars. Vito had finally gotten the thing he wanted, his name on a family, and discovered what came with it. One last meeting raided, one last motion denied, one last jury walking into a hotel under guard while he waited for a verdict that would decide whether he went home or disappeared into a number. April 4th, 1959. The long run ended with a headline. A federal jury came back on a Friday night and put Vito Genovese where he'd spent a lifetime dodging, on the wrong side of a narcotics verdict. 14 of his 15 co-defendants fell with him. Only Luis Fiano walked. Mandatory 5, max 20. Bail jumped from $50,000 to $150,000. Jean Capese and Vincent Chin Gigante went straight to a cell. Sentencing set for April 17th. Deportation talk in the air. The government story was simple and heavy. A multi-million-dollar pipeline feeding heroin in from Cuba, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Europe. Vito, age 61, as the control man. The same man papers had tied to the wartime black market in Italy, selling off American military goods like he was moving cartons of shirts. The same man locals in Atlantic Highlands still called a $225 a week businessman while agents counted the math and wrote $30 million next to his name. The next morning the papers started gaming the aftermath. Gangland power struggle to replace King. 2 scenarios, an Apalachin-style sit-down to bless a successor or a shooting war. Either way, cops would be watching hotel parking lots and hilltop driveways for Cadillacs with out-of-state plates. Anastasia's murder had forced a reshuffle in '57. This time the vacancy came with a federal case number. By April 9th, the tone turned personal. They stopped writing around him and started writing at him. Life will no longer be charming for Vito Genovese. The column spelled the rules he'd broken. Rules every smart hood learns early. Don't make an enemy of Mr. Whiskers, Uncle Sam in peg pants. You might bluff City Hall. You don't bluff the feds. And don't get crosswise with a woman who can talk. Vito managed both. They mocked the profile. 5'7", lemon skin, 2 cheek scars that didn't come from shaving. The tailored suits, block-long limos, and the house on the Jersey coast that looked down on Sandy Hook. Marble stairs, deep carpets, a $250,000 tag, the kind of place where you could flood and play hockey with gold plates for afternoon pizza. He'd been a national player, lottery money, union rackets, nightclubs, tracks, taking down 40 grand a week by some counts. But even then, he lived in the shadow of bigger names. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister, Luciano, the Chicago heirs, Jack Dragner in LA. This wasn't mythology. It was a ledger, and ledgers were finally catching up. He came off a boat from Resigliano at 15, about 1913. By 19, he had a gun pinch. Early partner, Frankie Yale, the same Frankie who made room for Capone in Chicago by putting down Big Jim Colosimo and Dion O'Banion. Then Lucky Luciano. When Tom Dewey burned the vice rackets in the 30s, Luciano got a sentence and Vito got scarce. Between 1917 and 1934, police pulled his coat 10 times, everything from disorderly to homicide, with almost nothing sticking. 2 months for a gun in 1917, a $150 fine for a gun in 1927. In 1934, a Brooklyn dispute over the beer. Business ended with Ferdinand Boccia shot up in a restaurant. Witnesses saw it. Vito got gone. For a decade, it was empty rooms and missed trains. The war brought him back into focus. 1944, Rome. O.C. Dickey, U.S. Army, CID, started peeling back a black market ring that was stealing the army blind. He found an official interpreter for the Allied military government, who also happened to be Vito. The file added a knighthood from Mussolini, Commendatore, and dinner lists with Hermann Goering and Count Ciano. Someone ran fingerprints. The Boccia case lit up. Dickey moved. The story goes Vito offered $250,000 to give him a break. It didn't work. Dickey shipped him back. The case fell apart anyway. Key witness dead by poison on the eve of trial. Judge Samuel Leibowitz said the quiet part out loud. Witness terror, kidnapping, murder. By devious means you thwarted justice. Vito walked. Until then, he'd kept his fights local. Then he made it federal. He married Anna in 1930. Before the ring, she ran the caravan club off the village, could swing a bar stool and prove it. By 1950, she left. He endangers my health and makes my life extremely wretched, she told the court. Then she sang. Rackets, weekly takes, $25,000 off the lottery alone, another $20,000 elsewhere. Narcotics, kickbacks, gambling, names. Costello, Anastasia, the regulars. She turned a domestic flight into a federal roadmap. Mr. Whiskers started circling. The pipeline case that dropped him in April 1959 didn't spring from nowhere. The winter had been a calendar of pressure points. Ormento, a chronic violator with a career's worth of dope convictions, walked into agents on a Bronx stairwell, bail at $150,000. Nicholas Tolentino, another fugitive, $100,000. The government rested with clean buys and courier stories that defense lawyers called lies and coaching. Judges denied mistrials, even as headlines called Vito a bosom pal of men still being dragged in. Washington kept posting victories, deport orders, denaturalizations, tax cases that sent old names away, while the jury box in Bix's courtroom filled and emptied each day. When the jury went out, April 3rd, 7 women, 5 men, sequestered after an 8-hour charge, Vito still had his old line, a $225 a week executive with bad luck in acquaintances. When they came back April 4th, the country got the other line, a boss on a narcotics conspiracy, mandatory time, with a door marked immigration after. The columnists weren't finished. They ran back through the reel, the way he ducked Dewey, the botcher fix, the marble house, the satin spreads, the cocktail rooms with names that filled books. They quoted him at his most human. Why does she do this to me? Why does she want to step on my heart? The answer they suggested was in the 2 rules he'd ignored. Don't dare the federal government. Don't arm a witness with motive. On April 5th, while he scrambled for the extra $100,000 bail, another piece drew a map of what came next. Sit down or war. Either a quiet vote to redistribute the business, or men in coats stepping out of cars the way they did in front of the Park Sheraton. No speeches, just muzzle flash. Authorities were ready for both. They remembered Apalachin, the steak smoke over Joe Barbara's lawn, cars in the ditches, big names answering questions about a sick friend. The file on Vito was never about romance. It was about a man who, for 40 years, made himself bigger than city cops and borough prosecutors, and thought that meant he'd always be bigger. It worked until the game went national and the quiet rooms in Miami filled with men who could count votes in Congress as easily as points on the street. In those rooms, they were planning one kind of invasion and one kind of succession. In Bix's courtroom, they were finishing another. On April 17th, the judge would pull a number from the statute. After that, another office might pull a passport. If there were going to be sit-downs, he wouldn't be in the room. If there were going to be shots, they wouldn't be aimed on his say-so. The marble house was gone. The limos were parked. The only thing left was a calendar and a chain of custody. For 40 years, he'd stayed a half-step ahead. Poisoned witnesses, vanished trains, a kitchen apron for foreign reporters, a rented cottage with 5 suits in the closet, and denials delivered with a flat voice and a lawyer at his shoulder. On April 4th, the step went the other way. The rule he'd ignored, Mr. Whiskers never forgets, finally caught up. And the men who taught him the code were already in other rooms, talking about what to do now that the king was down. April 15th, 1959. The papers weren't letting go, and neither was Albany. The State Commission of Investigation handed Vito Genovese a subpoena for May 12th. Same for Big John Ormento, Natale Evola, and Andrew Haynes. No questions, no theatrics. Here's your paper. Be back next month. Ormento had just been grabbed again on new narcotics charges. Evola was already in the case, and offstage, Russell Bufalino was still fighting a federal deportation order. 3 days later, it ended. April 18th. Judge Alexander Bix needed 3 minutes. 15 years for Vito Genovese, $20,000 fine, bail revoked. The 62-year-old denaturalized boss stood there, calm for the room, and said the only line he had left. "All I can say, Your Honor, is I am innocent." His lawyer, Anthony Calandra, filed an appeal and promised to ask the Second Circuit for bail. The courtroom groaned and whistled. The marshals took him. Everyone else got their numbers. 14 co-defendants drew at least 5 years under the 1955 mandatory narcotics law. Jean Capesse, 30, a mother of an 11-year-old, bowed her head and cried, minimum 5. Natale Joe Diamonds, Evola, 52, 10 years and a $20,000 fine. Vincent Chin Gigante, 30, 7 years, acquitted last May on the Costello shooting, but not here. The indictment said what the trial proved: a ring importing heroin from Cuba, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Europe, with Vito out front. It was his first prison term after decades of arrests, black market to murder, and a lifetime of beating the count. Now the count beat him. As a stripped citizenship alien, deportation was waiting at the gate. The wire services ran the rest of his file. UPI called him the Mafia's American chief, a one-time friend to Mussolini, a man who took the fifth 150 times before the Senate. Naturalized in 1930, citizenship revoked, subject to removal under the Narcotics Control Act. Pulled back to the States in 1944 to face the Boccia murder. The witness died, and the case collapsed. He left court then, untouchable. He left court now, in chains. What Apalachin was really about kept leaking into print. The 1957 Hilltop session didn't just juggle territories or calm nerves after Scalise and Anastasia, or reassure men spooked by the shot that grazed Costello. There was a deeper sore that never made the agenda because the troopers blew the whistle. Narcotics. 2 years after the raid, Victor Riesel put the government's view on the page. After interviews at the top of the Justice Department, he wrote it flat. The Dons, the men of substance, were ordering their people to back out of the heroin business. Not tomorrow, not with speeches, but out. Even for them, it wasn't clean. Some tried to quit and got murdered for it. The money was too big, the power too obvious. But the odds had changed. Congress had jammed the penalties up. Anslinger's bureau was stacking indictments. There were 1,500 convictions in 1958 alone. After Apalachin, President Eisenhower asked his new Attorney General, William Rogers, a simple question. Who are these people who think they can run a convention? Rogers went to Hoover. The Bureau put agents on every regional boss and built a 2-part, 217-page report. The conclusion inside Justice matched what the street was feeling. The smart money was moving into labor and legitimate businesses and away from dope. Not out of virtue, out of survival. So the calendar reads like a ledger. April 15th, subpoenas. April 18th, sentence, 15 years, 20 grand, no bail. The government got the king of rackets and called him what they believed he was, the US head of the Mafia. The same man who'd stood at Apalachin as a delegate now took a number in a federal system. He still nursed the old boss's fantasy that he could rule from inside. But the writing was on the wall. His name replaced Luciano's on the family door. His power ended where the gate clanged shut. The last word belongs to the room that day. Bix delivered it fast. The gallery reacted. The clerk marked the file. A lifetime of denials boiled down to one line of allocution and a chain on a wrist. Outside, the papers talked succession, another sit-down or another war. Inside justice, the plan was already in motion. Keep turning the screws, keep men like Genovese in prison or out of the country, and keep pushing the syndicate out of its most profitable trade. For once, the timetable wasn't Vito's. May 5th, 1959. Vito Genovese knew the verdict of his life was in. He called a quiet huddle to map the future. Who ran what, who got promoted, how to hold a family together from a cell. Brooklyn cops beat him to the punch. They hit the luncheonette at 203 Bridge Street and hauled out 23 men before the coffee hit the saucers. Reporters christened it a poor man's Apalachin. The joke stuck. The boss who'd once stage-managed empires couldn't get a backroom meeting off the ground. The cops said the order came straight from Vito and Mike Miranda. Purpose: stop outside crews from muscling into dope, gambling and policy in East Harlem and beyond. Graduate a few loyal soldiers into jobs vacated by big men, now jammed up or under glass. None of the 23 were marquee names. They were emissaries, message carriers for the hierarchy. Some had been visiting Miranda in the civil prison since he took the contemptful for clamming up about Apalachin. The meeting never met. 22 got hit with consorting with known criminals, posted $1,000 each in Bay Ridge Magistrates Court, and walked into waiting subpoenas. The Brooklyn DA's racket squad wanted them in front of a grand jury the next morning. The State Crime Commission tuned up its own paper. Detectives were still checking records. Every man in the room carried a jacket, most with convictions going back years. One more. Anthony Biondolillo, 12 served on a 14 for a gun, got yanked on a parole violation and sent back. May 6th. The DA's office made it official. This wasn't about ice cream sundaes. 23 known criminals, as the papers called them, were ordered to explain a Sunday brunch that looked like a sit-down. Was it Vito and Miranda parceling out authority for their time inside? Or a freelance attempt to inherit the Genovese-Miranda mantle? Assistant DA Aaron Cooter had been watching the Concord restaurant for 4 months. He handed what he had to Deputy Inspectors Joe Hauer and Walter Henning. The raid came when it came. Police wouldn't call it a little Apalachin, wouldn't call it anything. Rumors cut both ways, that the group met to stop new narcotics traffic or to corner the numbers. Either way, the subpoenas stuck. The shock waves from the 1957 Hilltop fiasco kept rolling. They rattled San Francisco's Jimmy the Hat Lanza, shook loose Russell Bufalino, and put heat on East Harlem's old guard. May 16th. Vincent Rao resurfaced. Tanned, well-dressed and suddenly cooperative enough to accept a subpoena he'd ducked for 7 months, he walked into the State Investigation Commission and took the 5th for 10 minutes, where he'd been. Mexico City, Miami, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, said the staff. What he lived on, what he knew about Apalachin on November 14th, 1957. Counsel Elliot Lombard told him to come back June 9th for a full hearing. Immunity would depend on checks with DAs statewide. In the elevator, jammed with cameras, Rao snapped, "What's going on? Is this Siberia?" He had 5 arrests since 1919, homicide, grand larceny, Sullivan law, none of them stuck. The commission penciled in Vito for June 9th too, if an appeal bond somehow got him out. The net widened. A cousin surfaced in the papers. Gabriel Genovese, 43, stood trial as an unlicensed fight manager. 10 men and 2 women picked for the jury. The charge: he'd secretly managed lightweight Ludwig Lightburn in 2 1950 fights with Orlando Zulueta. Ali Clark, the front manager, testified under immunity that he couldn't book bouts until he cut Gabriel in 50-50. Gabriel, they said, worked for Frankie Carbo, already under indictment and on the run. Judge John Mullins set it over to the morning. All of it landed on a mob already reeling. The key for the spotlight had cracked denial. Apalachin made the denial ridiculous. Now every day's addition, grand juries, denaturalizations, tax counts, narcotics cases, printed the names that used to whisper around clubhouse tables. The old hands, Luciano in exile, Costello wounded and then caged on a tax case, warned about heat. The new hands misread the temperature. They wanted Cuba back from Castro, Washington off their backs, and anonymity restored. They got the opposite. Washington answered with a list. The Justice Department built the 100 Top Hoodlums program, pooled files from FBI, Immigration Treasury, narcotics, tax, alcohol, counterfeiting, and went to work. Apalachin became both exhibit and roadmap. The crackdown that followed was patient and federal. Then the coast-to-coast pinch. UPI carried it. 21 big-name mobsters seized before lunch, 6 more wanted, on an indictment charging conspiracy to obstruct justice and defraud the United States. 3 faced perjury counts. 36 others, Joseph Barbara Sr. among them, named as co-conspirators but not indicted. The theory was simple. They lied, shaded, and stonewalled about Apalachin. Attorney General William Rogers announced it as the arrests rolled, from 6 a.m. wake-ups to noon call-ins. Bail ran from $13,000 to $100,000. Buffalo's John Montana posted the top number himself. The New York grand jury had drilled rackets in the garment trade and East Coast narcotics traffic. Maximums were modest. 5 years on the conspiracy, 2 per perjury count, fines in the low thousands. But the message was the time, not the number. The defendants' list read like a seating chart from the Hill. Joseph Barbara Jr. from Watertown, Massachusetts, John DeMarco from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, Frank DeSimone from Downey, California, Natale Evola from Brooklyn, New York, Salvatore Falcone from Miami, Florida, Joseph Ida, Highland from Park, New Jersey, James LaDuca from Buffalo, New York, Louis Larasso from Linden, New Jersey, Carmen Lombardozzi, Brooklyn, New York, Antonio Magadino from Niagara Falls, New York, Joseph Magliocco from Brooklyn, New York, Joseph Profici from Brooklyn, New York, Frank Maggiore from Elizabeth, New Jersey, Michelle Miranda from Forest Hills, New York, John Montana from Buffalo, New York, John Ormento, Lido Beach, New York, James Ostico from Pittston, Pennsylvania, Anthony Riella from West Orange, New Jersey, John Scalish from Cleveland, Ohio, Angelo Ciandra from Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Simone Scozzari from Rosemead, California, Pasquale Turigiano from Endwell, New York, Sof Honano from Tucson, Arizona, and Russell Bufalino from Pittston, Pennsylvania. Vito's name sat one column over as a co-conspirator. Freshly convicted on the narcotics case. Denaturalized, staring at deportation once he served his time. He had tried to set the board before the door closed. Promotions, territories, a line of succession. The raid on Bridge Street turned even that into another headline and another subpoena. By month's end, the picture was set. The men who once picked mayors and judges couldn't stage a brunch. The government didn't need to prove murder. It proved lies. And the family that now bore Vito's name learned what the last generation had learned the hard way. You can survive a shootout. You don't survive a paper war you keep losing.